Running a marathon sounded impossible to me not that long ago, but just 2 weeks ago I finished my first marathon in 3 hours and 46 minutes. And crossing that finish line taught me a lot more than just how to run. I'm not a natural athlete and I didn't grow up doing a lot of running, so I always had knee pain after running just a few kilometers. When I signed up at the end of last year, I didn't actually even know if I'd finish the race. But as I've set my sights on something that's a lot bigger, doing a full Ironman at some point next year, this was just my first checkpoint in that journey to make sure that I could actually complete something that was pretty difficult. But let me be clear, my training wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I didn't have a structure and I still don't to this day. That's probably something I need to fix. I also dealt with several injuries, mainly in my ankles due to tendonitis, everyone's best friend. And lastly, there were a lot of days where you feel a bit down, low energy, and unmotivated, and you have to find ways to push through. But given all of this, the thing that was most important was staying consistent, because being consistent and showing up is a lot better than achieving perfection. And what I found during this process is that the best thing I could do was not overcomplicate training. So all I did was pretty much zone 2. I spent about 98% of my time in zone 2, parking my heart rate at 155 and going on my merry way. There's a thing you can look up, it's called MAF 180, so MAF 180, which pretty much tells you what the upper threshold of your zone 2 region is. So this will be something like 180 minus your age plus minus 5 or so, depending on your current physical health and if you've recently been injured. But by and large, if you just stick to this rule and you just park your heart rate there, you can just keep going and you're doing a pretty good job. I would say if you take an 80-20 approach to training, that's pretty much got you covered. And when it came to managing injuries, pretty much forget about rice. It doesn't work, and the person who developed it even said so themselves. So, because your goal is to get back to moving as soon as possible, if your injury can bear load again, you want to start getting back into your normal movement patterns as soon as possible. Obviously, if you're injured, seek medical assistance, get that checked out, fix yourself up, and make sure you're ready to go. But otherwise, if you have something like a very light ankle roll, it's probably better to keep moving on it and walk it off than it is to stop moving at all and allow that swelling to increase. There's a thing you can look up, it's called MEAT, M-E-A-T, which takes a different approach compared to something like rice. And the overall objective is just get back to moving as soon as possible. You want to make sure that you're strengthening rather than staying sedentary. And I'll also add that because I'm training for a triathlon, it's actually been pretty easy to manage loads when it came to things like tendonitis, because you can just focus on other disciplines. So for example, running has had a pretty high impact on certain joints, things like your ankles, but then you can just go and cycle or swim and take the burden off those joints, allowing them to recover while you do certain conditioning to make sure that you're addressing the problem. So the last thing you'll want to be considering as part of your training is your fueling strategy, as on race day, you'll have a pretty miserable time if you don't consume any carbohydrates. You'll be hitting the wall and you'll start to feel really sluggish, as everything will just be way too heavy to move and you just won't have the energy that you need. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you're training up your gut to handle the amount of carbohydrates that you'll be consuming. This can lead to GI issues if you aren't ready, and no one wants to deal with that on race day. Next, if you're doing any training sessions or races that last 90 minutes or more, you should start to consider consuming about 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates every hour. And this is something that's time constrained, as the body has limits on how much you can actually absorb in a given amount of time. There's a lot more science behind what is the optimal ratio of sugars that you should be consuming, but in the spirit of not overcomplicating things, just focus on getting the correct amount in your system, and later on you can tune that based on how your body's starting to respond. I'll also add that gels are pretty expensive, so it's best to test these kinds of things with simple sugars, things like lollies. At some point, I'll be messing around with creating my own gels or simple kinds of sugary mixes, but honestly, just consume sugar. That's what the gels are anyway. You can find the ingredients on the front. There's just 6 different items. It's pretty simple and the majority of it is just sugar. But once again, keep it simple, don't overcomplicate it. Eat something like a lolly. So with training out of the way, we finally hit race day. And race day is going to test your preparations not just physically, but mentally. Around 33 Ks in, I hit the wall and it was pretty brutal. It felt like I was running with concrete blocks tied to my legs. Not the most pleasant experience if you ask me. So at this point, what you need to be thinking about is your why. Why exactly are you training for this event? You put in a lot of time, and are you ready to give up so simply? Probably not. I think it's at this point you need to keep digging deep to find the strength that you need to keep moving forward, because this is important to you and you're doing this for a reason. So just always remember your why. I'll throw my splits up on the screen. You'll see pretty much at that 33K mark, I started to get really slow. And around the 37, 38K mark, you start counting how many Ks are left until the end of the race. Because at that point, you're really running on empty. It's at these moments when you're feeling low that you need to remember your why and keep pushing forward. The most amazing thing about endurance sports is that you're racing against yourself and nobody else. With about 2 kilometers left, I started to pick up the pace, knowing that the finishing line was just around the corner. And honestly, at this point, you've been running for 3.5 hours, maybe 4, and you put in a lot of training. You don't want it to go to waste, so you start emptying the tank. That was the mentality that I had at the time. And soon enough, you'll be crossing that finishing line, hands waving in the air, having a great time, and then you'll keel over, looking back at that track thinking, I'm an absolute machine, while you gather your breath. Then you'll hobble over to the people who are giving you your medals, and you can just snag a bunch of refreshments, which are much deserved. You'll just be thinking to yourself, wow, I just did that. And while that pretty much wraps up my experience with my first marathon, I'd say it's the small things that make a pretty big difference when it comes to race day. Things like practicing your fueling strategy, making sure that you can handle the carbohydrates that you'll be taking in, making sure you also have the right equipment, testing that equipment before race day so that you don't get uncomfortable in those last few Ks where it starts to get pretty annoying when things are bouncing around or chafing. So make sure you test things early, make sure they all fit properly, and that you don't have any issues when it comes to wearing them on race day when you're going flat out in those last few Ks. And lastly, just put in the time. This is a pretty big achievement and not everyone will do a marathon. And just remember, you can only do one first marathon, so make it count. And obviously, regardless of the outcome, just be proud of that you've achieved something so big and that there's always room for improvement. So this won't be your last. And while I think those were things that I handled quite well on race day, if I'm being honest, one thing I didn't do was pacing myself. At the time, I was just racing to how I felt in the moment, probably surged a little bit more than I should have. And I definitely wasn't pacing myself and making sure that I stuck to like a negative split to go through the race, which probably would have made my experience in those last few Ks a bit more enjoyable. But it came back to bite me pretty hard around 33 Ks in, and I think in the future, if I stuck to a better plan and knew exactly what my splits should be throughout the duration of that run, it would have been a much better experience overall. But all in all, I'd say crossing that finishing line was one of the best experiences I've ever had. You'll look back at the course and you'll just think, wow, like I just did that. That was insane. And it makes you feel pretty unstoppable. And that's where you get into that really slippery slope of, I want more. So that's my current goal. I'm trying to chase that feeling by pursuing things like the half Ironman, the full Ironman, and that international full Ironman in 2 years. So if you're also the kind of person who wants to chase that feeling, you want to finish your first marathon, your first triathlon, or you just want to get back into shape, I'd say you're in the right place. So hit subscribe and let's keep moving.